What is going on, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome to another edition of Touchline Talk here on 110 Sports. Got a really good show in store for you today. It is one of the most wonderful times of the year, the beginning of the MLS playoffs, so we're going to cover that in depth starting right here in a minute, and then we're going to return to the supporters corner for a conversation with Jonathan Tannenwald of the Philadelphia Inquirer on all things MLS, specifically focusing on the Supporters Shield winner Philadelphia Union, how this actually happened, is he surprised by it, and then generally looking around the league and what his expectations are for the playoffs. But before we get to that, now that we're getting ready to kick things off tomorrow night with these Eastern Conference play-in games, I wanted to take some time to talk about some of the more interesting storylines and things I'm looking for in this postseason. And then as the action starts happening, we will, of course, react to all of it. The thing that I am probably more curious about than anything else is fairly simple, and it's, does history continue to repeat itself? I talked about this when the Union won the Supporters Shield. This idea that logic says it would be more likely for your LAFCs, your Atlantas, your Seattles, the big clubs with the money, to win in the regular season, where their team and the greater talent that they have is able to just succeed and be more successful over an extended period of time, as opposed to the unpredictable mess that is the playoffs. But that's just not the way this is working. The Red Bulls are the only team in the last 10 years with multiple supporters shields. And you've got this combination of teams that continue to get to MLS Cup. And the last 5 MLS Cups have had at least one of either Toronto, Portland, or Seattle in it. Obviously, you've seen Seattle and Toronto play each other time after time. It's the same teams that find ways to get there. They don't always win, and when Seattle and Toronto are playing each other, obviously only one of them can win. But it's the same tune pretty much every season. You can talk about how good LAFC was in the regular season last year, but it was Seattle who got out of the West. Seattle and Portland have dominated the Western Conference, and Toronto has dominated the East, and then you had Atlanta pop in there one time. And then going back, you had some other teams. But this is fascinating to me. So is this trend going to continue this year? Because Toronto's in the similar position to where they always are, near the top of the East. They're starting to get healthy. They're going to be a force to be reckoned with. But you look at the teams around them. Philly has no playoff history. Orlando has never been to the playoffs. And then the other teams that you're looking at potentially, New York City FC has a bad history in the playoffs, specifically when facing Toronto. The Red Bulls have a very disappointing history in the playoffs. The Crew have never done it with this group of players. LAFC have not been good in the playoffs if you look at some of the better teams in the West. It's either going to be Toronto or somebody's going to buck this trend in the East. And then out West, of course, your number one seed is Kansas City, but then right there, Seattle, Portland. So I'm really curious about this. Because if you're going based on history, you're probably picking a Seattle-Toronto showdown for MLS Cup again. Both teams have to feel good about where they're at. And so it's not your Atlanta who's been there and has players with an MLS Cup in the East. It's the Union and Orlando and a Columbus team that has not put these pieces together before. And NYCFC, who have fallen short time after time in the playoffs. This is really fascinating. So either it's going to be the same story again, or we're going to find something different. It's setting up to be very intriguing in that regard. The other things. What is going on with these quarantine players, and how much of an impact is this going to have? And in what sense is there going to be an impact? Because we went from all of these guys are not playing and missing at least one game, if not two. to all of a sudden, if you can get on a charter flight and you test negative, you can play. Probably. So Inter Miami is trying to get Rodolfo Pizarro on the field. The Union are trying to get Jamiro Montero on the field for their first game. And these are massive players. And then you got the fact that Diego Rossi tested positive. So he theoretically could have been in the mix for LAFC, and they could really use him against Seattle. That's obviously not going to happen now. But if, and we'll get to our conversation in the supporters corner, and Jonathan brings this up, if one of these guys has it and spreads it, you're in big trouble. So can all of these guys who, A, are they able to play? And B, is this going to be done safely? Because it just seems incredibly reckless. But these teams are desperate because having Pizarro on the field might be the difference between Inter Miami winning that game and not winning that game. That part of this has to be acknowledged. Jamiro Montero is probably the Union's most important player. And you can go down the list. Diego Rossi is the Golden Boot winner. The guys that are missing are crucial players. So, are they able to play? Is MLS going to get this to actually happen? Are they going to let these teams do what they want and have these key players available? And if that is going to happen, is it going to be able to be safe, or are we going to get an outbreak? And now there's reporting that if there is an outbreak, teams might have to forfeit. It's going to get messy. Can you avoid that? And if these guys can't get on the field, are we going to look back at this postseason and say, well, if it wasn't COVID and if X, Y, or Z player was on the field, this would have turned out way differently? LAFC Seattle is obviously your premier example of that. You've got other ones as well. Most teams have at least a player of note or two missing. So that part of this is very intriguing as well. It's going to be the story until we see who's actually on the field and how this all plays out. The teams I'm most curious about: Philadelphia, LAFC. The Union, for what I feel like are obvious reasons of really good in the regular season. Is this collective sort of greater than the sum of the parts approach able to work in the postseason when you don't have a Pozuelo, a Lucas Zelarayan, a Carlos Vela, whoever, insert star player here, to make the difference in one of these close games? Can they just continue to win game after game and do it against good teams? Because that's the other part of this that is not probably getting as much attention as it deserves. Take out the opener before COVID, the loss in Dallas. The teams that have beaten the Union, Portland, in the MLS's back semifinals, Columbus twice, and Toronto. Their performances against the best teams in the league, outside of the one time they demolished a weakened Toronto team, have not been particularly great. What they have done is they have consistently beaten all of the good, average, and bad teams that have showed up on their schedule. Which, to me, that's who you're playing. You take care of business. It is noteworthy that they have been able to beat the Revolution 4 times and have not lost to them in 5 games. That says something. But one of the values of the playoffs is that you cannot get through this thing without beating good teams. Really good teams. Not just good ones, but good, really good teams, great teams. The best teams in this league. It's just not possible. Because you've already eliminated the bad ones, and there are too many teams that are high-quality opposition for all of them to get upset in the first round or two. There is no easy path. Can the Union navigate that? And then also you have the home field advantage aspect of this, and the reality that for anybody else to win MLS Cup, something that has not happened this season will have to happen, and that is the Union losing at home. And not only losing, they have not drawn. They are a perfect 9-for-9 at Subaru Park. How much of a role does that actually play? It's still an important deal, even though you can't have all of those fans, just from a travel standpoint and a confidence standpoint, because they feel so good in that stadium right now. there's a lot going on there. I'm very curious about all of it. And then on the LAFC side, season did not go as planned. They were looking fine at MLS's back without Carlos Vela. I wasn't too worried about losing in a penalty shootout to a good Orlando team. But then it got ugly for a while. Now you have Vela back, but you lose some key pieces on international duty that theoretically you're not going to have Rossi for at least the Seattle game. Who knows how long it takes for him to get back on the field and if they're still alive at that point. So maybe you get your other international guys back. But a couple weeks ago, they were pretty close to full strength. And you felt really good about them. You catch a bad break at the end of the regular season. Now you got Diego Rossi testing positive, and all of a sudden it looks very, very different. And you got to win in Seattle to even get to the second round of the playoffs. At some point, this team needs to go take care of business in the postseason. I really thought that they had figured some things out last year, but clearly they hadn't. It's one of the more fascinating stories in this league to me. Not just this postseason, but generally speaking. Is you can play all the pretty soccer that you want. Bob Bradley demands it. They deliver more often than not. But that is just not how you succeed in the postseason. Which gets to this broader point that to me is the most important factor in the playoffs. How many of these teams can win multiple ways? It is why Toronto, Seattle, and Portland have been so successful. They can go pitch a shutout if they need to, and they can go score 4 goals if they need to. They can play in any kind of game. They can hurt you in transition. They can break you down if you give them the ball. They are multi-dimensional teams. That is the key to success. Can LAFC figure out a way to make that happen? Because you cannot just outscore team after team after team to hoist MLS Cup. You can do it once, maybe twice. But there's going to be that game, like you saw against Orlando in MLS's back, and I harped on it right then. There's going to be that game. Can you find a way to win it? Can you win ugly and then blow somebody off the field when your attack is firing on all cylinders? The other things, real quick, does form mean anything? NYCFC are flying. Seattle is 1-1-1 in their last 3 games, not coming in off the greatest stretch of performances. Does that mean anything, or should we just throw it out the window? Only time will tell. And then finally, are we going to have a significant amount of injuries, and are injuries going to play a huge role because of the amount of games these guys have played? Toronto, Columbus, LAFC, all getting healthy. The reason the Union won the Supporters' Shield more than anything else is that they were able to stay healthier at the end of the season and over a long stretch of time. They didn't have their preferred 11 for large stretches, but you look at what happened to Columbus when you lose Zelerion and Nagbe, what happens to Toronto when you've got 4 or 5 key players out. That was part of the key there. Is there going to be an injury that determines some part of the playoffs? Is that going to be a big story? And then ultimately, my prediction. I'm going with the Columbus Crew over the Seattle Sounders in MLS Cup. I am in love with that Crew midfield. The fact that Caleb Porter and Darlington Nagbe have been there before. I said I thought they were the best team in the league when they were playing like the best team in the league. I don't think that was a fluke. They were not the same team without these guys, and that's the question, is they need to have everybody available. They don't have the depth. They don't have difference makers off the bench. But it's also worth pointing out that they would only have to play one true road game to get there, and that would be in Philadelphia. Of course, that is a big if and a big challenge to win that game, because you're not playing Toronto in Toronto. So it shapes up nicely for them in that regard. I'm just never going to bet against Seattle in tournaments, but there's also just the reality it's so difficult to repeat and win again. And I just think Portland has too many injuries to overcome. The Nias-Goda one was a massive blow. And you already lost Sebastian Blanco. I just don't think they have enough left. So that's where I'm going. I got Columbus over Seattle. And then ultimately the deciding factor for me is the fact that Columbus would have home field advantage in that game by the slimmest of margins. I think it's .01 points per game higher for the Crew. But that's my pick. I'm not backing down on my belief in Columbus. I'm not worried about that poor stretch of form that they had in October. They weren't healthy. Now they're healthy. I think they're the real deal. I trust Caleb Porter. I've got the Crew lifting MLS Cup. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, our conversation with Jonathan Tannenwald of the Philadelphia Inquirer. Really good insight across the league, a little bit of NWSL as well. Definitely don't want to miss that. You're watching Touchline Talk on 110 Sports.